I'm happy to be with you, and Sasha asked me to come and make a presentation on the emerging church, Emergence Christianity. I did not have a second thoughts. I accepted it. Well, I'll do it for Sasha and for some of my friends whom I know here in Sacramento. So thank you very much for inviting me. Now I will try to share as much as I can with you tonight and also tomorrow. I see that you just moved into this new facility, new building, and a lot of other things needs to be put in place. I expected a bigger screen and all that stuff so that you can see. Now, those of you who sit in the back row, you may learn a lesson for tomorrow. Sit in the first row so you can read some of the slides that I will have, that I will share with you. Now, I also found out this morning, today as I arrived, about the tragedy in this church that just happened. And all I can tell to the Eckridge family is, may God give you strength and courage to go through difficult times. And if you don't mind, I will dedicate this presentation tonight and tomorrow in the memory of your son and in the honor of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because of that situation, I will read one biblical text which may help us, because I think it is it suits, or it is appropriate for this occasion. In Hebrews 11, verse 1, it says, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see." When I lost my parents, and I could see the difference, some of my relatives who don't have this eternal hope, they look at the burial, the goodbye to our dear ones, completely different than I do. Yes, we are hurt, our hearts are torn, and we cry, and it's sad. But there is one thing we know, and this is not fantasy. If it should be real for you and for me, we know for certain, as you know, that tomorrow's sunrise will take place again. You know, it's certain. And we know that we will see our dear ones in the morning. That should be certain. If you have questions about it, you're not sure, then the next step is make sure that your relationship with Jesus Christ is on good standing. That means give yourself to Him. Dedicate yourself to Him. And then read His Word and pray and ask Him to be with you. So we all suffer, we all go through these things, but we have that faith. Now, you will see how this also plays a very important role. You asked me to come and talk about the emerging church, or emergent church. Would you please just turn next slide? But I will talk to you about the emerging church, but at the same time, we will end up in talking about Emergence Christianity. Some of you probably never heard of the emerging church. Some of you know more than the others and probably know quite a lot about it. You probably have read enough. I was asked at a Thanksgiving dinner back in 2006, simply sitting around the table, and one of the persons there, a friend of mine, asked, "John, well, you teach church history, so what can you tell me about the emerging church?" At that time, I did not know much about it. I saw a couple titles in the book, advertisements, and so I was clever enough to say a few things and get myself out of the situation. But that person bought me a book, The Emerging Church by Roger Auckland, and some of you who know something about the emerging church, you probably read that book. It is very critical of the emerging church. I've read it through because I had to. I felt obliged now. Well, if somebody gives you a book, you better read it, because next time you see the person, they'll ask you about it. That is how all started. And on top of it also, I teaching church history, and I have to always keep update. I have to know what's going on. But we historians usually like to deal with things that happen in the past, and somehow we ignore contemporary events. Well, the emerging church is very much contemporary. What is happening right now? The emerging church, as the term tells you, okay, I'm using the term emerging or emerged, which another synonym for it is it appeared, it came into being, approximately 1999-2000. And but then I learned very fast that emerging means something else, and I will share that with you. So now, excuse me, okay, thank you. I'll probably just give you these signals and so on. There are a number of characteristics. I don't want to spend too much time on the emerging church itself. Let me just share with you the following. The emerging church, first of all, is, as you see on the slides there, it's not a new denomination. There are a number of things I will tell you that please remember as we go through the discussion, that you don't fall into default thinking. Because every time when we say Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, Catholic Church, Seventh-day Adventist Church, we're talking about denominations. When we speak of the emerging church, we are not talking about a new denomination. They don't want to be a new denomination. So if that's possible. Now, what they use the term church, and for them it means not an institution, it means a community. So now we're talking about emerging community. That is as simple as that. So there is no hierarchical organization. You are not going to find. There is no emerging church institution. There is. It is rather a new way of thinking. Now, in order to give you a parallel to it, in this world in which we live, I'm sure you most likely meet Muslims, you meet Buddhists, Hindus. Many of you came from former Yugoslavia, so you encountered atheists. Okay? Now, have you noticed, or do you notice, when you talk with these people, or before when you talk to them, have you noticed that they see things and think differently than you do? And often it comes to a point that you simply you may use the same words, but there's a different way of understanding. There's just kind of impasse. So that is what we are talking about. And I'll explain more what that means, new way of thinking. It is a new worldview. Now, when I use this term, worldview, and Emergence use this word, worldview. They use it a lot. Now, I don't know how to translate that into Serbo-Croatian, but it would be something like the way we, kako vidimo svet, pogled na svet, tako nešto. But that word pogled is much broader, it's much deeper. Okay, so this word, worldview, Emergence, I'm referring to people who think this way, who identify as belonging to this emerging community. I will refer to them as the Emergence. The Emergence talk a lot about new worldview. And they talk a lot about new paradigm of thinking. And that forced me to say, okay, this is what they're talking about. Let me see what do they mean by it. And therefore I had to go into that subject itself. So there is a whole new presentation on that particular topic, and I'll try to share as much with you as I can. And then they like to use the term, they would say, we are not the emerging church, we are not a new denomination, we are emerging conversation. They like to talk and present themselves in that way. So now, this one paragraph is quite a lot now. This is what we will more elaborate. So I'll give you a few more characteristics which are important to keep in mind and to remember. The next one is worship. They are very much, when it comes to worship, and this is what they are known for, because this is how in 2001, 2005, that period, and even today, and this is where even kind of infiltrated into our church, and you see that, and sometimes you're surprised, what are they doing? You know, this is strange. And sometimes you don't approve, sometimes you wonder because it is different. And this is kind of the venue. And so when it comes to worship, there are two particular characteristics or objectives that they have. And that is, they want to make worship experiential and participatory. That is their objective. Now, I agree with them on that one. It is necessary, and I will explain what that means. What I disagree with them is, how do you make it experiential and participatory? That is, it's not so much what they want to do, but it is how they do it. And that's where the problems are, when we, as far as we, Seventh-day Adventists are concerned. May I have the next slide? They are ecumenical. Well, that is all of them. They are ecumenical. That is the heart of the movement, and therefore they are not necessarily asking for uniformity. So we often confuse ecumenical with uniform. They are not asking for uniformity, but they are asking for ecumenical, for unity. And I'll give you a couple of experiences and examples what is meant. Now, some people may ask, what's wrong with unity? Shouldn't we all be united? After all, Jesus prayed in Gospel of John, they should be one as I am one with you. I mean, what's wrong with unity? Well, nothing's wrong with unity. The problem is the way that unity is constructed and what is expected from all of us who participate in that unity. Next one is the postmodern tenets form its core. Now, postmodernity, you heard that word is being used left and right all the time. Often it is abused and misused. I spent half a semester in my classes talking to students about postmodernity. We live in an age, now if you ask me when postmodernity begins, the age of postmodernity begins with the 1960s. We as generation, and my generation, we so-called baby boomers, okay, they call it that, means if you were born after 1945, you are 1940s, even 1950s up to about 1955, you are considered a baby boomer. Maybe even the 1950s, you're a baby boomer. So those of us who were teenagers, 1960s, and then by the 1980s, 1990s, you have a whole new generation. And so today's children, this generation today, our children and our grandchildren are post-baby boomers. And it's a whole, you probably notice that. When you talk with your children, there is something is going on here, we don't talk the same language. There is a problem of communication. And you can also see when you were young that there was some problem with communicating with the older generation of your parents. Now, you can say this is generational gaps, And that is true. But that generational gap is growing bigger and bigger as new successive generations are coming. So if you want to talk about emergence, this emerging conversation, it is very postmodern. Matter of fact, it is postmodern. And they like to use the term not only postmodern, but they like to use terminology like we are post-Christian, post-modern, post-Western, and they even go that far and say we are postmodern, we are post-Christian, we are introducing new Christianity. So they are pushing the frontier. Okay? So that's another characteristic. Next one. Spirituality, religiosity. You probably heard this term and it is being thrown around all the time. This generation today, in emergence, they don't like religiosity. They don't like to say, I'm religious, because they connect religious with institutional. And they like to say, we are spiritual, I'm spiritual. So today, when you talk with, even listen to pastors, evangelicals, everybody is spiritual. And they make this emphasis, spiritual, not religious. And I listen to it and I'm wondering, I say, okay, of course, I'm spiritual too. And the problem is that I think they exaggerate in making the distinction, and they do it for a purpose. And I will explain why they do it. And because I cannot see how can one be spiritual and not religious, and being religious and not being spiritual. God expects from us to be spiritual, and spiritual meaning that you are under the guidance, leadership of the Holy Spirit. However, there is the other spirit. And so the distinction of this, what spirituality are we talking about? And also, every one of us is spiritual, and I don't see how can someone not be religious. And they don't like to make that distinction, but nevertheless, it needs to be pointed out. So, it is in that context, spirituality, religiosity, that I have these sub-bullet points, these next four. Okay, you heard of contemplation and meditation. All right, Bible talks about meditation as well. What's wrong with meditation and contemplation? Well, you have to be careful when you go around and you talk with people, because after all, we Seventh-day Adventists, I am not against contemplation and meditation. I'm not. But there is a difference between biblical contemplation and meditation versus what they sell you as contemplation and meditation. And that needs to be sorted out and figured out, and because we are told by John, test the spirit or the spirits. Now, they use that text as well. They also tell their people, test the spirits. And of course, I am told, test the spirits. But then they're testing the spirits in different way, the standards and all that. And that's also fascinating, so I'll talk about that. Now, you heard of... Wait a minute, I don't have that word there because I'm very careful. I don't want to stir. Spiritual formation. You heard of that one. I have there spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are actually disciplines that people are being taught, trained told, asked to do, shown how to do, and all of that. And there is a variety of spiritual disciplines. All of these spiritual disciplines, once they are being taught, you are trained to do, they are, when you learn all these spiritual disciplines, when you put them all together, that program or that approach to spirituality is called spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is another term. Matter of fact, that term, that phrase, spiritual formation, is approximately 30 or 40 years old. And most likely since 1960, 1970s. This is according to them, to one of their main gurus, people who are behind spiritual formation. This is what they say, and I'm just quoting them. 30 to 40 years old. I suspect it's, by the way, spiritual disciplines go back to Middle Ages and go to ancient times. But this spiritual formation is actually a new phrase that replaces traditional word that we used, and that is biblical growth or spiritual growth. That's what we use. Or we would use the term being born again, okay, or converted life, or something like that. So spiritual formation is a phrase that kind of replaces that. Spiritual disciplines are being taught. Now, I'm going to make a claim, and I'm writing a book on this, and I pray and ask God to give me time and patience and wisdom and tenacity and perseverance to finish this as soon as possible. And I am making a claim that spiritual formation is that all spiritual disciplines are created, and I'm quoting this from people who are pushing all of that, so I'm not inventing this. All of spiritual disciplines, and some of us Adventists who are, and there are some Adventists who are propagating spiritual formation, they may disagree with me, and what I'm telling you is I am not inventing it, I'm quoting them, I'm just sharing with you what they say. And after studying and observing what they are doing, I am convinced that they are more correct than our people who are pushing spiritual formation, and they are doing it because they don't know what they're doing. That all spiritual disciplines are created for one purpose, and that is to lead you toward higher contemplative consciousness, which is meditation that leads you into mysticism. Now, some of you may ask, well, what's wrong with mysticism? Well, that's another story, another chapter, and all of that, where, and I've seen it, I attended some of their workshops, some of their conferences, and I've seen it. Before those meetings, I would probably think like many of you, because you don't know much of mysticism. I assume that mysticism is basically, people who pray a lot, and they are hermits, and they do it on their own. And, just extreme praying, too much praying. No. It's way, way more. We're talking about higher consciousness, and when they talk about higher consciousness, it's much different. Higher level of consciousness, which is basically where you are trained how to achieve that level of consciousness where your mind stops. You are not supposed to think. You are not supposed to reason anymore. And why is that? Because they believe, they argue, that is the only level of consciousness that you can actually hear the voice of God. And I've seen people who went through that. I did not go through that. I was observing. And it was an interesting experience because people say, what are you doing here? Why don't you participate? But anyway. And I have seen some interesting things, and I am convinced that it is not the Holy Spirit, it's the other Spirit. So that's enough about... the greatest fear that I have about this emerging Christianity, emerging church, whatever you call it, the greatest fear I have, that people who kind of begin to play with it and going into that slowly, that they will be step by step led into mysticism, and then we are talking spiritism. Theistic evolution, that's the next characteristic. I can also tell you and assure you, please, every single emergent is theistic evolutionist. We are talking about rejection of Genesis 1 creation story that God created in 6 literal days, and each day was literal 24-hour period, and arguing that those days are either, there are 2 versions here, either argument that each 24-hour, each period designated in Genesis were evening, some morning, that is a longer period of time, then therefore you take evolutionary picture inside. Or you have the other version now, which is being promulgated by some theologians, and that is that what Genesis 1 talks about is 6 literal days, each day long 24 hours. But those 6 literal days, Genesis 1, is not talking about that God made the world in 6 literal days, but gave function to what already existed and came into being through evolutionary process, but then gave it a function during those 6 literal days. In other words, like there was already a ball of fire, which now God designated as sun, and gave it a function to give sunlight to this planet. So you have that version. So one way or the other, if you argue for functionality but not materiality of creation, you are in a way, again, kind of denying the material creation. They basically run that argument on the Hebrew term that used in Genesis 1, bara, which can be translated as kind of functionality. The problem for them, but what is good for us, is, and also gives us now, tells us the importance of the Fourth Commandment. The problem for them is that in Exodus, in the Fourth Commandment, when God uses and he says, remember the seventh day to observe the holy, because I have made the earth, the heavens, whatever, and Hebrew term there is not bara, but is asa. And the term asa is the same term which is used in Genesis 2, where God made the human being, physically made it. And so that Fourth Commandment tells us, I made the earth. Literally. You cannot say now functionality alone. And so the importance, in other words, now what we have the argument, we can say, listen, you cannot read Genesis alone and stay there. You have to read Genesis 1 together with Exodus 20th, verse 11. In other words, you have to read it together with Commandment 4. And also then, one of the big issues is completely new understanding of philosophy of history. Now, you may believe that, well, history is history. Every historian tells the story, the historical narrative in one of the same ways. Well, let me tell you as a professional historian, no, there are different philosophies of histories. This is now where we come into different worldviews. How you see not only the world, physical world, but how you understand physical world, fundamental questions of life, ultimate questions of life. How do you see everything related to life, everything, the entire complexity of life? And how do you tell the story? How do you view historical process? When you tell the narrative, the story of humanity, how do you tell it and how do you interpret that story? There are different views. Karl Marx sees it different way than you and I as a Seventh-day Adventist. Catholics for many years, and Presbyterians and Protestants, other Christians, for decades, I mean for centuries, they saw human history in very similar way the way we see it. But that is changing drastically since the 1960s. And when people begin to adopt theistic evolutionism or evolutionary theism, everything begins to change. And I will show you some diagrams and you'll see everything changes. And Emergence Christianity is exactly that. We are having completely new worldview which is slowly permeating the thinking of the people and the Christians, and it is getting into the textbooks, into academic world, and the thinking. And so pretty soon, those who hold to the scriptures will become odd birds or odd. I mean, you're going to just be, who are you, man? What are you talking about? I can say that approximately, for sure, 85, if not 90%, some of my colleagues say even more, 90%, maybe 95% of academia are theistic evolutionists. You and I, we Adventists are very small and very few, and especially younger generations. And so this is where the struggle and the war is going to be the battle. Now, why is that important? It is very important because it affects everything. And this is what I need to get into and try to explain to you some of the ramifications of that. So, let me see the next slide. Okay. Now, these are the, I don't know, can you remember those 8? I gave you only 8 characteristics, if you can recall that. Keep in mind as we go along and talking about it. And then you will see how these things begin to fit. But those are the main characteristics. Of course, there are more. We can go down into details. But I tried to make it as simple as possible. Now, next few slides, what I want to show you is the emerging church. When I began reading about it, and that actually, just let me go fast through this and then just try to explain this. The Leadership Network, that was a national organization within North American evangelicalism. That leadership network is mainline Protestantism. Now, I will be using the term mainline Protestantism. What we mean by mainline Protestantism is the following organizations. The Anglican Church, Methodist Church, Lutherans, Episcopalians, those are mainline Protestants. We don't include in mainline Protestants Pentecostals. They are kind of Pentecostal Christianity. Then there are different terminology here. Sometimes these terms, they overlap. There is no clear distinction between them. For example, we use the term fundamentalists. We use the term evangelicals. And so these are categories which are difficult. Evangelicals, fundamentals, they are very difficult to define, and I'm not interested to go into and spend time into that. Sometimes we Adventists say, well, we are fundamentalists. In many ways we are. But I would not go out there and identify myself. People ask me, are you fundamentalist? I wouldn't say yes, I am. Why? Because there is a whole category of fundamentalists out there with whom I disagree. As that meant. So evangelical. Oh, you are evangelical. A lot of Adventists like to say, well, I am an evangelical. Well, I am in many ways evangelical, but I would not identify and tell the people, yes, I'm an evangelical. Why? Because there is a whole group of evangelicals out there that they think we're different. What I mean by that is the following. When I go to professional organizations, and usually because as a historian of secular history, I also go to the meetings which are not necessarily Christians. They're just people, agnostics, atheists, nothing. I mean, there is no such thing as nothing, but they don't identify as Christians. And in conversation, people soon find out, and usually around the table when we eat, and it happened several times that they would tell me, oh, you're a Christian. Now, what do we respond? And I like to often be contradictory and be clever, and for a variety of reasons maybe make a conversation. But I learned that when they tell me, oh, you're a Christian, I tell them, well, I am and I am not. And that immediately starts now, because that puzzles them. Wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Because either you are or you are not, you know. Well, that is precisely what I want, because I want them to ask me a question. Then I tell them, listen, if I have told you, yes, I'm a Christian, you would have put me in a box. Your mental box, what a Christian is for you. And that is, most likely they know of Catholics, Methodists, whatever, and you would think that that's what I am. And I'm not that. But if I were told you I'm not a Christian, I'd be lying, because I am. So, and well, what are you? Then I tell them, instead of giving you a label, let me tell you what I believe. And then I tell them the basic fundamentals beliefs. And they would say, wow, I never heard of that. What is that? I would say, well, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. That's a whole new box now in their mind. So that's what I'm trying to tell you, is that labels that we use, we have to be careful. So this leadership network, it existed before 1999, before 1990s. It is out of concern for younger generations that these, especially younger pastors, that they decided that they are going to organize and established a new sub-organization which they called Young Leaders Network, and to address the problems of a large exodus of young people from institutional churches. And in 1997, they hired a 30-year-old Doug Paget. Doug Paget is one of the leading emergents. Now, Doug Paget, 3-4 years later, now this is, I'm taking this out from their own, simply telling you from their own sources. In summer of 2000, in a telephone conference between themselves, in summer to Paget, Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, Tim Kill, Chris Shea, Tim Condor, whatever these names mean to you something, all of them were talking on this telephone conference. That means they're in different places talking among themselves. And they are talking, how should we call ourselves? Because they already see the kind of a group is gelling. And they say, please give me next slide. They say they liken themselves. This is what they say. They say, we were thinking about, when you go to the forest, and if you are interested to see what is the future of the forest, you don't look at big trees, because the big trees are just about to die. Where you look to see whether the forest is healthy or not, whether the forest will live, is you look down to the floor of the forest to see whether there is new growth. And they said, if they see themselves as that new growth, and therefore the emerging, and that's why they decided to call themselves the emerging church. All right? I mean, what do? You take that as that's what they tell you. Well, I found out in the writings of Tony Jones, in one of his books, he kind of off the cuff, kind of, sometimes these people sometimes say things probably unintentionally. It's the slip of the mouth, of the tongue, and this is where you can find out what's happening. Tony Jones says that as they were discussing, and probably on that day, and when they were on the day of the phone conversation, I'm sure this is not the first time that they talked how to call themselves. At least among 2 or 3 of them were talking about it. Now there is a larger group, and they finally supposedly came up with that name. Tony Jones says that somebody told them, "Why don't you call yourself Emerging Church?" That perked my ears. I said, wait a minute. If somebody is telling them, "Why don't you call yourselves Emerging Church?" that means that there is idea of an emerging church already existing. There is something. Why would persons say that? And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to go and pursue and find out who in the world came up with this term, and whether anybody talked about the emerging church before. Next slide, please. Oh, take it back, please. So, I went on internet and looking for books that use the title Emerging Church. And I came across half a dozen of books that were published. And the earliest one, it took me a long time. I got some of these books from England and Holland, secondhand bookstores everywhere. But the earliest one that I found out is in June 1968 by the author Roland Wilkins and William Colt. Now, Roland Wilkins and William Colt are not well-known theologians. They're not. But they wrote this book with the help of Raymond Schmant. But Raymond Schmant is a well-known theologian. They published the book which is titled The Emerging Church. And with Imprimatur and Nihil Obstat. Now you know what that means. That means that when the book is published, and when you come here, you have the title page, and then you turn it over. Before content, you always look here for the copyright page. This is at the top, you always have this statement, Imprimatur or Nihil Obstat, which means that whatever is in the book, it is officially approved by the Catholic Church that contains no theological error. And therefore, Catholics can use it. Wow. That drew my... it was a good start here. Next slide, please. I found also then, so that in blue, that is the book that I just talked to you. I also found another, within a couple of years, 1970, 2 Protestant Presbyterian ministers, Bruce Larson and Ralph Osborne, in 1970 published the book, The Emerging Church. I have the book. I have all of these books. Then, a year later, a Pentecostal pastor, Maxwell White, he's very much a pastor. He's not a theologian necessarily. He writes many of these booklets on variety of topics, but he also published one called The Emerging Church. Then, in 1980, The Emerging Church book by John Carr. John Carr is Presbyterian from Scotland. Then comes a book, The Emerging Church by Johann Baptist Metz. Johann Baptist Metz is well-known German theologian. And he is, this book is very good in terms of information. Johann Baptist Metz actually he attended the Second Vatican Council of 1962-65. And then Ronald Wilkins the book that I already mentioned to you before. This is the second edition. The book was now republished, edited, and in one volume, so in 1981. Next slide. Then comes, I discovered a book in 1993 by Don Scott. Don Scott is former Pentecostal who left Pentecostal movement in order to join the Emergence. And he writes this book, The Emerging American Church. And then I came across this book, Dennis Doyle, in 1992, before 2006. And I came across this book. As I browse often through the bookstores, I bought this book even before this friend of mine ever asked me about what do you think about emerging church. So I bought this book, and this book was sitting on my shelf all these years. And now when I got interested in it, I said, oh, here is an interesting book. And you will see, I'll share with you more about. Dennis Doyle is a Catholic theologian, professor of church history at Dayton. And then there are a couple of books down there. The Open Church by Michael Novak. Michael Novak is a well-known Catholic journalist, theologian, Jesuit. Resilient Church, The Necessity and Limits of Adaptation by Avery Dulles, SJ. SJ stands for Society of Jesus. That tells you that he is a Jesuit. Next slide. Okay, these are the pages. I just scanned them. They are all there. If you don't ever think that I made up these titles, they are real. They are there. They exist. So next slide. So the point of all of this is that the idea of the emerging church existed before, as early as 1968. Now you want to know what is in what is inside of those books. Well, how much time do I have here? Well, if I go until I finish, I'll be not going to be finished till midnight. I can go with this topic, honestly, guys, forever. I mean, there is so much information here. What I'm trying to tell you is that I don't want to mischaracterize the Emergence friends, but if they believe that the emerging movement started in 2000, they are mistaking themselves. Every movement in history, whether it is called feminist movement or communist movement or whatever, Advent movement, every movement in history. Now this is secular history now. Every movement in history is a byproduct of an ideology that is already there. The ideas turn into ideology. And ideology, if they're pushed long enough, they acquire adherents and followers, which makes a movement. So what begins to happen in 1999, and then we see this manifestation, this movement, this is just byproduct, it's end result of something that was going on before. And what I have discovered is that the emerging church, that very book in 1968 that I pointed out to you, it is inside of that book. And then, okay, by the way, to make the story short for you, in all these subsequent books, because I read them all, I tried to see, okay, what are the common ideas, and so what are they, beside the point. If you have two different books, the same title, okay, what is the connection? Why do you have same title? So I tried to see what's going on. And all those characteristics that I gave you in the beginning, they are main characteristics that are being promoted in these books. And so the very first title, that The Emerging Church by Wilkins, that was published in 1968, is saying the following. In that book, it is the Catholic Church which is called the emerging church. Now, what does that mean? But we are talking here about the emerging church. And if you ask me about the emerging church movement, majority of them are Protestants, mainline Protestants. So what does that have to do with this? It is that book which calls the Catholic Church the emerging church. Now, what does that mean? It means the following. The Second Vatican Council, which was opened in 1962, and it lasted until 1965, more than 3 years, was the most important event of the 20th century as far as Christianity is concerned. It is only now, in the last 10, 15 years, and if you pay attention, that there is a very increasing number of books being written about the Second Vatican Council and acceptance of the fact that the Second Vatican Council was the crucial event of the 20th century that many Christians ignored and believed is just another council. And a lot of people would argue, well, nothing changed at the Vatican II. Well, it is true that when it comes to theology, the Church has not changed its position. But when it comes to attitude, style, and how it relates to the Protestants and the rest of the world, it changed drastically. And so I was surprised. Now this may be a little, to be careful here, I'm taped. This may be a little critical of us Adventists. I was surprised that with the passing of Dr. Bakioki and with the retirement of Professor Dedoran, we do not have, we Seventh-day Adventists, we do not have specialists on the Vatican II. And I was surprised, how is it that we Seventh-day Adventists somehow did not catch that the Second Vatican Council was extremely important. It is only now that we are beginning to say, wait a minute, but we are saying, well, it is important because of this phenomena. Somehow 40, 50 years we missed it, instead of we being at the forefront and letting people know that the Second Vatican Council is extremely important. It is other scholars who are telling us today that the Second Vatican Council is the most important event, not only for 20th century, but as a guide for the future of the 21st century Christianity. So the question is now, what happened at the Second Vatican Council? Well, I was back in 2009, I was attending one of the seminars by Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. He's a Franciscan priest. He runs his Center for Contemplation down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And they were advertising a meeting, like a big conference in the emerging church. So I said, well, I better go there and see what's happening. Then they had another one called an Emergence Christianity a year later. So I went to see that one. So Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren and some other people were there. And on the last day, this is 2009 in October, this will happen in Dallas, Texas. And I was surprised that, in a way surprised, in another way I was not that surprised. But he made the statement, this was the last meeting on Sunday as we were about to part, the entire meeting. There's about 450 people attending. And he made a statement and he said, listen, he was trying to impress the audience that what he and people like him are doing is very important. So he's trying to impress the people, and he said, listen, guys. And he's basically talking, because most in the audience are Protestant. He says, listen, you Protestants. Now, of course, he's very friendly. You know, that doesn't sound, he's not threatening, but he said, listen, you Protestants. He said, you guys, for 400 years, since Council of Trent of 1548, 1562, that's right after Martin Luther, you know, in those days. Since Council of Trent until Second Vatican Council, it's almost 400 years. He said, for 400 years, you Protestants and we Catholics were shooting arrows at each other. It is the Protestants who began to challenge us Catholics that we are teaching heresies and we are not teaching the biblical truth. And we, Catholics, at the Council of Trent, sat down and we fell into the trap that you Protestants made. And so we set to argue with you and to come up with counter-arguments and defend ourselves to prove you wrong, that we, as Catholic faith, are correct. And therefore, for 400 years, we were writing books against each other, we were talking against each other, we were treating each other as enemies. In other words, we were arguing with you through reason. We were reasoning things out. You argue one thing, we argue the other thing. Then he said we were even building churches across from the street from each other. We would not cross into the church of the other. We would not intermarry. He says we would fight wars between ourselves. It says after 1945, after World War II, we finally recognized that this leads nowhere. So we decided at the Second Vatican Council, and you read some of the books who write about the Second Vatican Council by the Catholic theologians themselves. They will tell you the following. The Catholic Council was not about changing theology. It is. When it says changing theology, it means changing Catholic doctrines. It says it was about style, the way we talk. So this Richard Rohr said, we decided we are not going to do it, with you, when we talk and do relationship. We are not going to do it anymore Dominican way. We are going to do it Franciscan way. And kind of say, okay, what does that mean? And now you're ready. If you know something about Dominicans and Franciscans, you immediately now you can figure out, oh, that's what it is. In other words, Dominicans were known, this comes back to Martin Luther, 16th century. Dominicans were a Catholic order which dedicated itself to intellectual pursuit, becoming scholars, academics. It is out of that movement that you have the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. Jesuits are the best selected young men trained to do theology and develop defending the Catholic faith. And so there is no joke with Jesuits. Those guys know what they're talking about. Okay? So, he said, for 400 years, we were doing it Dominican way. That means through arguments, through writing books, attacking each other. Because Protestantism is religion of the reason. You will see, I will explain to you how that does with experiential worship, Protestants. So anyway, he says, we will not do it Dominican way. We'll do it Franciscan way. What is a Franciscan way? Well, Francis of Assisi, by the way, the latest Pope, is Pope Francis. He took the name after Francis of Assisi. I was very much interested when the new Pope, the election of the new Pope was going on. I was interested whether they'll take the name of John Paul III or maybe John 24th. Because all these popes, when they choose name, the name choosing indicates the policy the Pope will follow. So this guy elects the name Francis, clearly indicating that he is going to continue the policies of Vatican II. Franciscan way. What does that mean? Prayer and meditation. In other words, we are not going to argue with you anymore who is right and who is wrong. That's not the point. We're going to pray with you. We see you as our brothers and sisters. You just have to come back to the Mother Church. See, that's the style. It's changed. And then all the documents that came out. So that's one point he pointed out. He said the Second Vatican Council is, well, that's number 2. He also pointed out that meeting. He said that he was talking about spirituality, and he was emphasizing, because he's a mystic himself, and he said that growing, now this is very interesting, an increasing number of scientists is beginning to study the phenomena of meditation. They're already, scanning the mind, and they want to see what's happening. And the point, he said, what will happen? He says, down the road, and he predicts by 2020, 2025. Now, whether he's correct on it, that's beside the point. But he's saying, down the road, more and more scientists will be involved into work on what is meditation, what are the effects of meditation, whether there is something like, the spirits or whatever it is. Now, that is frightening. Why? Because you can imagine when Spiritism, the spirit, is being explained and validated by science, it will be mind-shattering for millions of Christians. Because honestly, let's say, even us, people today believe more scientists than pastors, than theologians. Science, people believe science has the answer for everything. So that's another development that, we can watch. Now think about UFOs and that stuff. There's more and more about it. Why is that? Now, you may say, well, that, stories. But people believe those stories. Aliens have come. There's more and more talk about it. NASA, government, all of them are doing something about it, whether it's real. You may think, well, that, those are conspiracy stories, that's foolish, that's fantasies. But people believe those fantasies. You go to any store and you see in spirituality section, meditation and spirituality, how many books there are. So this is becoming real, okay? In other words, medieval Christianity, and I want to say something about, I have to stop because this is long. I see you're tired, okay? Let's just end with this. If you walk into a Catholic or Orthodox church and participate in the worship, and and then compare that when you go to a Protestant worship, you walk and you walk out, which of the two is more experiential? Now notice this, all of your senses are involved in it. Visual, sense, incense, ears, smelling, even touching, even tasting, because you get the participate in the Mass. It's very experiential. And what happens in the Protestant churches? you sit, you hear the sermon, which is pretty much lecture. That is what emergents are complaining about. And I'm saying we Seventh-day Adventists better do something. Now, the problem is that these people bring in stuff like Eucharist. They're bringing Lutherans, Emergents, they're bringing in Eucharist, the Mass. Mystical experiences, you pray, you do spiritual disciplines. They are experiential. And people are thirsting for experience with God. You know, reading the Bible, that engages reasoning. You have to read, you have to study. And that is kind of, I don't have that, you know. You see the promise that it tells you, they tell you, if I pray in a certain way at a certain time, if I contemplate, I will get in contact with the divine. That's what the devil says. If you want to, the answer is, if you want to hear God speak, you open the book. And God will speak to you at His own choosing, not at your choosing. There's no way, whatever you want, you can do whatever you want and meditate and just stand on your head. That will not make God speak to you. So there are problems here, but emergents are pointing out and say the Protestant worship has become routine. Christian life is nothing but scam. So they're calling for authenticity, they're calling for experiential, participatory, all that, which I agree, yes, okay. But we have to be very careful, and this is now the problem, that in the process of many of us who are trying to be introduced in innovative worship, we have to be very careful. Okay, if they turn around chairs and if they dim the lights, I say, okay, you know, the chairs and doesn't bother me. That's not God ordained. But we have to be careful that in that process we don't get into mysticism and we don't get into idolatry, worshipping nature and space, stuff like that. I stop here because I can see, you know, you listen to me, but it's already long. I talk too much.
I'm not
yeah.
sleep.
You can ask questions if you want.
I'm not going to sleep tonight. The problem is here. How come that I never, ever heard about that emerging church in our churches or in our talking, in our midst, except maybe 2-3 people in our church who are involved in this? How come that nobody says anything about that? It's the first time ever. Ever. And you're telling me they are already too far into our lives already and we don't know anything about. That is a frightening.
Well, it is to some degree frightening. There are people who were saying things, but not enough. And I'm reluctant to say, but I have to tell you reality. I am the one who has gone the deepest into it.
That's sad.
And I'm a historian.
For our church.
Yeah, I'm a historian. I teach. I have training in theology, but I am now writing. Maybe I should have published it earlier. But I'm busy. I teach full time. So there are some of my colleagues who are involved in it, but basically it is. You see, a lot of you people who read about this, those of you who read it, you basically read the critics, like Roger Auckland, Carlson, and some other. You read the books by the critics, and that's okay. I decided not to, I read all those books, critics, but I decided not to base my research on what the critics are saying. I decided to go actually into their own ranks, talk with them, meet with them, read their own works, and actually expose from inside. And it was interesting, sometimes not pleasant. It's not easy when you are in a workshop where everybody, they are there to learn how to do these spiritual disciplines. And I'm sitting around the table and everybody's looking at me, what's wrong with you? Okay, well, why are you here? If you are here, you're supposed to do like all of us are doing. Well, I would usually tell them, well, I am a historian, I'm writing about emerging church. You don't want me to get involved with you, then I lose my objectivity. And they say, oh, that makes sense. But I did not want to get engaged in it, involved in it, because I could see right from the beginning, I say, no, there's something fishy here. This is not the Spirit of the Lord. And but anyway, I would rather take an attitude instead of, maybe it's serious question, what happened to us Adventists in meantime? We should have been more aware of it. But on the other hand, it's not productive at all to begin to throw stones and rocks at each other. It is simply, I learned it, I'm going to come forward, publish it, talk, and educate, and try to help people. Because a lot of our people are doing a lot of things that they are not aware of. There is a lot of ignorance here. This is very crafty development. I published a number of articles. There are some other people who published. So there is something, but not enough. I agree with you. We should have done much, much more. But we are catching up. The Lord is with us. Yes?
Yeah, I must admit, I haven't heard of this emerging church up until now. But it's still not clear to me, is this a movement within our Adventist church, or it's a movement within Christendom as a whole?
No. It is primarily movement within the Protestant denominations. In other words, the Protestants themselves are saying that mainline Protestantism is about to be dead. It's dying. They're closing, they are losing their young people. Where are those people going? Into Emergence Christianity. So it is affecting the Protestant mainline Protestantism the most. And that's why evangelicals and fundamentalists are so vicious against them. Because the old generation, this emergence movement is destroying Protestantism. Let me put it a different way in Adventist language. You guys know Revelation, don't you? Protestantism, what I see this, and I'm going now, this is often stepping out of the boundaries here. I see this is, Protestantism is changing from the Lamb speaks like a dragon. This is the beast of Revelation 13. That's happening right with us, right now. This is the beast, because I can share with you and tell you, when it comes to theology, because they need theology, because they're teaching their own. When you go to their emergent theology, you will see that what they're saying is, we go back to patristic theology. That means the early Middle Ages. Because they say, in order for us to go into the future, we need to go back. So they have this phrase, ancient future. But what are they doing? They're taking people back to medieval theology, which is back to Catholic Church. And what is interesting is, I have never come, when they, in their books, they criticize, they're very critical. I'm talking about emergence. They're very critical of Protestant denominations and Protestant practices and Protestant faith. All the evils of the modern world they blame on Protestantism. I have not yet come across criticism of Catholicism and Pentecostalism. Of course, they will mention, oh, the church has persecuted Christians and that was unfortunate. But there is no criticism of Catholicism and Pentecostalism. Now, when it comes to our church, of course, our people read books, our people see things, and so there is kind of influence. But these influences are more into these practices, innovation in churches. The greatest concern I have is when people begin to dedicate spaces and they say, this is a holy space. Nothing is holy space until God makes it holy. You and I can dedicate it holy, but it doesn't mean it's holy. Only when God is present, it's holy. When is God present? Only when we obey His word. So you go back to the word, okay? And so, in other words, this is the language which is very deceptive. I published an article in Review and Herald, if you guys, some of you read it, the last Sabbath of June. They published my article called True Lover or Seducer. I take the image of a seducer. You probably know what a seducer is. Womanizers. A seducer can uses the same words like a true lover to seduce the girl. When I tell my students that, the girls, they go, ooh, ooh. They get scared. This is, what should I do? I say, well, the fact is, the realization is, it is up to the girl to figure out who of the two is seducer and who is the true lover. One of them wants to marry her, the other one wants to use her for the night. They both speak similar language. They make similar promises. So how do you learn? They ask me, how do I know to make the difference? I say, well, it takes time to learn, to listen and figure out who is lying and who is telling the truth. Maybe sometimes listen to your parents. Read to the book in spiritual terms. You see, we are living in an age which is very, very deceptive. And again, the importance of going back to the book. I think I should stop here, Sasha. This is, my people here fall asleep.
No, not really. You wake me up.
Okay, should we?
Usually I sleep when my pastor talks.
Don't say that. Okay, guys, should we add any other questions or should we pray? Pardon me? You want to sing?